Bugonia is a very well-made movie with some great performances, a great soundtrack, some great tension and plotting, and I think I kind of hate it, or at least the movie definitely seems to hate me. Okay, just to emphasize, I did really enjoy this on its surface. I think the performances, especially Emma Stone, Jesse Plemons, did a great job at these very intense, very different, but both very intense performances or intense characters, which were then nicely balanced out by newcomer Aidan Delbis, who played Dawn and who has this much more tender presence to him.
How can you tell she's an alien?
But the thing is, it does some things towards the end that I'm going to talk about in this video, so, this is going to be spoiler-filled. If you haven't seen it yet, watch this later. But the way this movie concludes has me conflicted, for one, as to, how do I even interpret this on a literal, a direct level, or, what is actually part of this story world and what is just a kind of imagination. But the more important question, which is going to decide, for me at least, where I land on this movie, is to what extent it actually has something to say with the way it ends, or if in the end it's just kind of style over substance and it doesn't really have anything to say.
Why have you shaved off my hair?
To prevent you from contacting your ship.
So quite early in this movie, where Teddy and Michelle, the characters played by Jesse Plemons and Emma Stone respectively, where they were interacting with each other, I had this fleeting thought where I thought like, oh, maybe at the end there's going to be a twist where it turns out Emma Stone is an alien after all. And I remember thinking, though, that I really hoped they wouldn't go for such an obvious twist, because it would just kind of ruin the whole tension of the story so far. But then, of course, at the end, it did. Spoiler alert again, Emma Stone is revealed to be an alien, and I'm still trying to make sense of that.
I am an alien from outer space. I am not a human being. Thanks.
So there's multiple ways to interpret this ending. If you just take it at face value, if you assume that Michelle is an alien within the context of the story, that, the way it plays out at the end is a literal continuation of the events that preceded it, then I have some issues with this movie. For starters, I don't think the idea of Michelle being an alien or not was actually an interesting, dramatic question for this movie. I think, at least for me, as I was watching it, I don't think the question of whether or not she may have been an alien or that Teddy may have been right was more interesting than the idea of Michelle being confronted with this far of a conspiracy nut job and then having to navigate the kind of psychological mechanisms that he confronts her with. That to me was the more interesting dramatic conflict, the idea of having to reason or having to at least level with someone whose concept of reality is so far removed from your own. And, I think the way she does so, at first trying to kind of bring him back, but then trying to meet him in his world, that to me was a lot more interesting than what the twist at the end retroactively says about that whole progression. Because again, if you assume the ending is literal, then the whole progression up until that point, the kind of psychological complexity of it, that's just completely gone. At least to me it was. I saw some people point out that they suspected that Michelle was an alien, especially also when she gave that big and very specific speech about who she is and where she came from and what the Andromedans, or whatever they were called, what their history was and their plan for Earth. But the way I interpreted that scene, at least at first, was that she went into that sort of secret basement and went through his documents and kind of started to own his world a little bit, and then used that to fire back at him when Teddy returned from the hospital, because she also realized she couldn't make it up the stairs with her broken knee, so she had to find some other way to defeat him besides trying to escape physically from him. So to me, I read that scene as her trying to read and trying to digest as much of his worldview as possible in order to then weaponize it against him, which she up until that point had failed to do because she tried to give some some affirmation to his questions, but you could kind of tell that she was stumbling in a lot of places, and so in the end, this is how she kind of conquered him in a way. But again, in retrospect, if you assume the ending and kind of retroactively look back at everything, knowing she's an alien, then that whole scene just becomes a basic confession, and everything that before that, like all those little hints of humanism that just become pretend instead of like genuine emotions, they become like a facade. And I'm not sure. I just don't think the dynamic is as interesting if you retroactively reverse the roles and place Emma or Michelle, her character's name, in a different light like that. And even worse, if you assume the end as literal, then that also means that Teddy, who up until this point has played this very much delusional, this very delusional character who's very much reminiscent of the very real problem of conspiracism that we have nowadays. The problem of people kind of detaching from each other's realities by ending up in these information loopholes or feedback loops that just make them detach from their lives and their families and their jobs and whatever, their whole sense of reality really, in an increasingly severe way. This is a real societal problem with real consequences. But again, if the alien is an alien at the end, then Teddy becomes like a hero. Like he becomes the hero who was right all along, and not even because he believed. It's not even that he had a belief that was proven right. We also learned that he had multiple victims before this, and 2 of them were aliens, as he said. So he already had factual evidence. He wasn't even guessing anymore at this point. He knew that aliens existed. He knew that when he had Michelle, that he had found like an accidental higher figure. And so I'm just not sure how I feel about that idea of having him retroactively being the clear-headed sort of hero who is coded for the most part of the movie with elements from people in the real world who are the most delusional in a very real and direct sense. That just didn't sit right with me at all as a sort of meaningful commentary on conspiracism. But again, this is only when we interpret the ending as literal. This is only when we assume the ending as it is at face value.
This is a joke, then?
Sorry, that was the best I could do.
No, it isn't.
Okay, let's reset.
The other way to approach it is to look at it more metaphorically or more symbolically. In that sense, the final twist is more of an imagination of what Michelle was to Teddy, and which also reveals some deeper dynamics between them that are there regardless of whether or not she was an alien. Because I think that's probably the most interesting thing that the movie is trying to get at, that regardless of whether or not Michelle is an alien, she still has the same, or she still sort of holds the same power over Teddy, and they still have the same dynamics between them, or they still have the same relation between them, because of course she's the big CEO, he's the kind of lonely employee who suffered at the hands of her company, but is also dependent on it still for his well-being and for his livelihood. And in this sense, it becomes less about conspiracism and more about a sort of class struggle. And when I kind of thought about that, I appreciated the movie a little bit more. But then I kept thinking about it, and then that interpretation also started to cause some friction within me. Because I get the idea that Michelle is a kind of capitalist bad guy, basically. She's someone who holds the means of production. She has some control and something to say about the well-being of the world around her and the people beneath her. And she's clearly not wielding that with the proper responsibility or with the proper attention. There's that funny bit at the beginning where she talks about giving her employees more freedom to do whatever they want, but they also have to remain conscientious towards the company, because it's the kind of do what you want, but this is a business after all, and go home whatever you want, but make sure the work is done. There's a lot of these contradictions at the beginning of the movie, which were kind of funny.
Feel free to leave early. Unless you're busy. Or you have things to do, but feel free if you can.
And which illustrate a lot about her character. There's a kind of facade that she presents, and there's a kind of reality of what she actually wants and what she's actually working towards. Which is that two-faced aspect that a lot of big corporations have, the way they present themselves and the actual consequences that their actions have in this world. But my problem here is more about what all this says about Teddy. Because if Michelle wasn't actually an alien in this interpretation, if that ending is more metaphorical, then that means that Teddy was really this disgruntled guy or traumatized guy who fell into this rabbit hole of conspiracies and then ends up blowing himself up in the end. I'm just not sure what the movie is trying to say about him or trying to make us feel about him. Because when you also take into account the very ending of the movie where Michelle then wipes humanity from the face of the planet, and you get that really cool sequence, which, granted was really well made, where everyone's just dead, which can symbolically either suggest that that's what capitalism is eventually going to do. Michelle's going to do her thing, and when she's done with all that, then humanity's going to be over. But the way they present it is not just as a kind of inevitable cause and effect, but also as a kind of moral judgment, as a way to say that humanity wasn't well enough, or wasn't made well enough, designed well enough. We aren't able to cooperate well enough, and so to some extent at least, we deserve whatever we are getting. And when you kind of then take that sort of sentiment and then retroactively apply it to Teddy and Don, then it becomes just a much more cynical picture of the idea that, of course these losers are not going to save the planet. Everyone's just deluded and dumb and stupid, and they're just going to try to do something, but they're just too lost or too caught up in their own fantasies, and they'll end up shooting themselves in the foot, or in the case of Teddy, blowing themselves up in the closet. Like, to me, it felt like that's the kind of message that kind of crystallized for me after thinking about it some more. And again, I'm just not sure how I feel about that sort of category of cynicism. I'm okay with movies that have a more tragic or even a more pessimistic view of humanity, but at least then add some substance to it, or show that to me in a way that illuminates something meaningful. And I'm just not sure if this movie did that. I'm not sure what the takeaway here is beyond just that sort of surface level layer of everything's messed up now and there's no saving it, and we're no longer even capable of saving ourselves, even if we tried, because who knows what the truth is anymore, and we're probably going to end up killing ourselves anyway, so why bother, And yeah, that's something that I'm not sure is resonating with me a lot at this moment in time, at least. For a minute, I thought there were some similarities here between this movie and a movie like Eddington, which also has that kind of downfall into absurdity and madness, and that also ends on that more abstract or a kind of symbolical, metaphorical note, or becomes more subjective towards the end, in the same way that this movie arguably does, if you assume the ending is not literal. But if you look at the main character of that movie, at least it felt like he was much more humanized than Teddy is in this one. I think Jesse Plemons played a great character here. He did a great job, but I do feel like this movie judges him in a way that Eddington's filmmaker did not do for Joaquin Phoenix's character, Joe Cross, I think he was called. And yeah, again, I'm not sure how to feel about it. So yeah, if you have a different interpretation, I'd love to hear it. But for now, at least, I'm trying to kind of approach this from different angles, but none of them so far have really led to me finding anything of substance yet, or something meaningful to really take away from this besides just being a kind of cynical complaint about the state of humanity as it is, which, you know, I think can be well done again, but I'm just not sure if that's what this was.